They said the factory ran like clockwork. Machines screamed, belts rolled, and men moved in rhythm, but beneath that noise was a quiet hatred, something that lived in the walls, in the whispers, in the way certain names were spoken. And at the center of it all was a man named Frank Dillard, the supervisor everyone feared but no one respected. Before we dive in, make sure you're subscribed for more dark, true crime-inspired stories just like this one. We uncover the shadows behind ordinary lives. Frank ran Riverside Foundry, a dying plant in a dying town. He was a man who still talked about the good old days, when things were simpler and men knew their place. His crew was mostly made up of immigrants and minorities, people who didn't talk back. But there was one man who did, Marcus Hill. Marcus was a quiet, disciplined worker, the kind who showed up early, stayed late, and didn't waste words. He'd been there 6 years, running a press machine so loud it drowned out his own thoughts. But he had dreams beyond the factory. He was saving for a small trucking business, a way out of the grind. Frank didn't like that. In his mind, ambition wasn't for people like Marcus. Their tension started small, Frank joking about Marcus's accent, calling him boy, nitpicking his work even when it was perfect. Marcus kept his head down at first. He had a wife, Tasha, and a daughter starting high school. He couldn't afford trouble. But hatred is a thing that festers in silence. It eats the soul slowly. Every comment, every insult, every snicker behind his back became a stone in Marcus's chest. Until one morning, when it all snapped. It was a Friday, storm clouds gathering above the smokestacks. Frank walked the floor with his clipboard, shouting orders. Marcus's machine jammed, just a minor issue, but Frank saw it as blood in the water. He stormed over, grabbed Marcus by the collar of his vest, and yelled in front of everyone. Maybe if you people worked harder, this place wouldn't fall apart. The room froze. The hiss of steam and clank of metal seemed to stop. Marcus pushed his hand away. For the first time, he looked Frank dead in the eyes and said, "You don't talk to me like that." It was quiet, but it cut through the air like a blade. Frank's face turned red. "Get the hell out of my factory," he said. "You're done." Marcus stood still for a long moment. Everyone expected him to beg, or curse, or throw a punch. But he didn't. He simply took off his gloves, dropped them on the ground, and walked out. The storm outside broke as he reached the parking lot. Rain poured down in sheets. A few workers watched from the windows as he climbed into his old Ford and drove away. Frank muttered something about filing the paperwork later and went back to yelling at the others. But there was a look in his eyes, a flicker of something uneasy. Marcus didn't go home right away. He sat in his truck for a long time, parked by the river that cut through town. The rain blurred the world around him. He thought about how hard he'd worked, how much he'd swallowed, and how little it mattered. He called Tasha and told her he was coming home early. She said dinner would be ready. But Marcus never made it home. That night, the rain turned to fog. By morning, the factory's night guard said he saw a car parked near the loading dock around 2 a.m., an old Ford pickup, lights off, engine running. He didn't think much of it at the time. When Marcus didn't show up for work Monday to collect his final check, no one said a word. Frank claimed he'd been troubled anyway. But 2 days later, Tasha called the police. Marcus hadn't come home. His phone went straight to voicemail. His truck was missing. Detectives canvassed the area but found little to go on. Then a week later, a fisherman found something floating near the riverbank, a wallet. Inside were Marcus's ID, some photos of his family, and a time card stamped from his last day at the factory. The police questioned Frank, of course. He said Marcus had left angry, muttering about quitting for good. Maybe he ran off, Frank said with a smirk. But his eyes kept flicking toward the window, toward the gray water outside. And then, one night, something strange happened. A janitor locking up the factory swore he heard crying in the machine room, soft, like someone whispering through the metal. When he turned the lights on, no one was there. Just a puddle forming beneath one of the presses, though the roof above wasn't leaking. The janitor quit the next day. The town began to talk. Some said Marcus had gone missing on purpose. Others whispered that Frank had finally pushed someone too far. But the truth, as always, was darker than anyone imagined. Because 3 weeks later, police would drag the river, and what they found would turn the whole town upside down. The morning they pulled the body from the river, the fog was so thick it felt alive. It clung to the water, rolled through the trees, and wrapped around the flashing red and blue lights like a shroud. Detective Elena Torres stood by the riverbank, coffee in one hand, notepad in the other, watching as 2 divers surfaced. One shouted. The tone in his voice was enough to still every sound on the shore. What they dragged up wasn't a mystery to anyone watching. The clothes, the boots, the chain around the neck, it was Marcus Hill. His skin was gray, his face barely recognizable, but his wedding ring was still there. The same gold band his wife had described to them over and over. The same one he'd refused to take off at work, even when the rules said he should. When Tasha saw him, she didn't scream. She just fell silent, like the world had stopped moving. She'd always believed he'd come home. Now, the truth had found her instead. Frank Dillard heard about the discovery on the morning news. The anchors spoke with that polished detachment, like they were talking about weather. Local man found dead in the river, foul play suspected. Frank stared at the screen, jaw clenched. He turned off the TV and poured himself a drink, even though it wasn't yet 8 a.m. He told himself he didn't care, that Marcus had probably done it to himself. But when he glanced at his reflection in the glass cabinet, he saw sweat on his forehead. Detective Torres didn't buy the accident theory. The autopsy confirmed her instincts. Marcus had water in his lungs, but also bruising on his neck and shoulders. Someone had beaten him before he went in. There were fragments of rusted metal under his fingernails, matching the type found inside Riverside Foundry. She went to the factory that same afternoon. The air smelled of oil and heat. Frank was in his office, pretending to fill out safety reports. Torres stepped inside, badge in view, her tone polite but sharp. "You were the last known person to see Marcus Hill alive," she said. Frank leaned back, fake confidence in his smirk. "He quit, detective. Stormed off. Guess he couldn't handle the pressure." Torres studied him for a long moment. "Funny thing," she said, "the coroner found rust flakes under his nails. Same kind your machines shed." Frank laughed, but it came out hollow. "You think I tossed him in the river," he said. "You've got no proof." But proof was coming. When they searched Marcus's truck, found abandoned in an empty field 2 miles from the foundry, they discovered fingerprints on the door handle that didn't belong to Marcus. They belonged to Eddie Malone, one of the factory's night shift workers. Eddie was young, quiet, always kept to himself. But when the police brought him in, he broke faster than anyone expected. He said Frank had called him the night Marcus disappeared. "Told me to meet him at the loading dock," Eddie said, hands shaking. "Said he needed help moving something." When Eddie got there, Marcus's truck was parked by the door. The 2 men were arguing, Frank shouting, Marcus trying to leave. Eddie said Frank hit him first, hard. Marcus fought back, and Frank shoved him into one of the old storage pits behind the building. When Marcus didn't move, Frank panicked. He told Eddie to help him. Together, they loaded Marcus into the truck and drove to the river. "He said no one would miss him," Eddie whispered. "Said guys like that come and go." By the time he finished his confession, Torres's pen had stopped moving. She looked at him and said softly, "You know you're going down with him, right?" Eddie nodded, tears running down his face. "I know. I just can't sleep anymore." When police arrived at Frank's house that night, he didn't run. He stood on the porch with a cigarette in hand, watching the cruisers roll in. "Took you long enough," he said as Torres stepped out. Inside, the house was spotless. No pictures, no family, just emptiness. Frank didn't ask for a lawyer right away. He just sat at the table, staring at his hands. "He pushed me," he muttered. "Always thinking he was better. They all do." His voice cracked, a lifetime of bitterness spilling out. "One mistake, and they forget who built this place." Torres leaned forward. "You didn't build anything, Frank. You just made sure no one else could." He didn't respond. Just stared at the table as the cuffs clicked around his wrists. The trial was short. Eddie's testimony sealed it. The jury took less than 3 hours to convict Frank Dillard of second-degree murder and abuse of a corpse. He was sentenced to 40 years in a state penitentiary. The judge called it a crime born of hate and arrogance. Frank didn't flinch. He just stared straight ahead as if the whole thing was beneath him. Months passed. The factory shut down not long after the verdict. The new owners said the place carried bad energy. Locals said they could still hear the hum of machines on quiet nights, even though the power had been cut for weeks. Some claimed to see a man's reflection in the factory windows after dark, his eyes calm, his hands still stained with grease. Tasha and her daughter moved away. They never came back to Riverside. But every year, on the day Marcus disappeared, flowers appeared by the riverbank. No one knew who left them, though some suspected it was one of the old workers who had watched that final argument but said nothing. As for Frank Dillard, he didn't last long behind bars. 6 months into his sentence, he was found dead in his cell, no signs of struggle, no clear cause. The guard said he'd been talking to himself at night, mumbling about the river and a man standing by his bed. Officially, they called it heart failure. Unofficially, the town had its own theories. They said the river takes what it's owed. That sometimes, the water remembers. And at Riverside Foundry, where the machines have long gone silent, the walls still seem to whisper his name. The river kept its secrets, but some say justice isn't always served in court. What do you think? Was it guilt that killed Frank Dillard, or something darker waiting in the water? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below, because that's where opinions clashes. And if you crave more stories like this, subscribe.